Are psychiatric diagnoses trendy? Methodological problems. So, it has been claimed that it's trendy to have a psychiatric diagnosis. That there's something fashionable currently about having a psychiatric diagnosis. People desire to have psychiatric diagnoses. The claim is that that's what's currently occurring within, say, modern society, modern culture. As such, people are seeking out psychiatric diagnosis or they're self-diagnosing. Generally, people who make this claim say that it's a bad thing. It's bad that this trend is there. It's bad that psychiatric diagnoses are seen as fashionable. It's bad that they're seen as being desired. Additionally, some people who make this claim seem to be very skeptical about psychiatric diagnoses themselves, whether it being people wanting a psychiatric diagnosis or clinicians actually giving psychiatric diagnosis. But lots of people have said, no, this is not happening. Often I find it's actually people with psychiatric diagnoses who are arguing that there is no trend going on, that it's not fashionable, that it's not considered desirable to have a psychiatric diagnosis, or at least desirable for no other reason than to have one. So people who say psychiatric diagnoses are good, I've benefited from my own psychiatric diagnosis, they're saying there's not loads of people out there who want to have a psychiatric diagnosis on the grounds that they're somehow trendy or fashionable or seen as desirable. So my initial question is, what evidence is there for this? What evidence is there that psychiatric diagnoses are or are not trendy? Well, to my knowledge, very little. I'm not aware of any study that's actually given any reliable evidence for this. So, on what basis are people making this judgment? Well, potentially they're going on some sort of either intuition, so that it just seems intuitively right or intuitively wrong, or potentially they're going upon experiences they've had, experiences of meeting lots of people who might have psychiatric diagnoses or think they've got a psychiatric diagnosis, and judging from there. And to whatever degree that evidence is or is not reliable, it's not been put into a published study. I suppose my own perspective on this is that if it's occurring, I'm not seeing much evidence of it occurring. But at the same time, what I'd say is that I don't really know what's trendy at all. We typically think of trends occurring in young people. I don't know what trends are going on currently. But even if we look at people of my own age, I don't really know either what trends are going on generally. I'm an autistic individual who doesn't have much of a social life and doesn't really follow modern culture. I don't think I'm really in much of a position to reliably know what is going on and what's not. As I was thinking about this, my thoughts moved on to a slightly broader question of, could we ever reliably establish whether psychiatric diagnoses are trendy or not, or more specifically, to what degree they're trendy? Be it really trendy, 50% of people today think they're trendy, or not at all trendy. Say, way less than 1% of people think they're trendy. I just want to think about why it might be difficult to establish that psychiatric diagnoses are trendy. Why it might be difficult to establish the exact degree to which people have a view of psychiatric diagnoses whereby they're somehow trendy or fashionable or desirable to have. So I'm going to discuss multiple problems of establishing this. So I'm going to outline a number of problems in trying to establish whether psychiatric diagnoses are or are not trendy. The first problem is, what do we even mean by trendy? For something to be a trend, do we need 1% of people to follow it? 10%? 25%? 50%? So what do we even mean to say it's trendy? And secondly, people might differ in how they understand something to be trendy. So imagine if everyone who said, psychiatric diagnoses are not a trend, thought you needed 10% of people to follow the trend for it to actually be a trend. Whereas imagine if all the people who said psychiatric diagnoses are trendy only thought 5% of people needed to follow the trend to actually count as a trend. Now imagine if hypothetically the number of people who actually think psychiatric diagnoses are trendy was 7.5, halfway in between both those two numbers. Under both sides' definition of trendy, they'd be right. People who deny it's a trend, who need it to be 10%, well, it's only 7.5, so they're right, it's not a trend. People who think it is trendy, but they only think a trend needs to be present in 5% of people, well, they'd be right as well, it is a trend. So there's a definitional issue here of how much do we actually need something to be trendy for it to actually be a genuine trend. Secondly, someone can vary in how heavily they follow the trend, so if there's something, say, popular on TV that everyone's watching, someone might be completely obsessed with it, buy the t-shirt, buy the soundtrack, buy the action figures, whatever, whereas someone else watches it because it's trendy, but they only watch half a series, for example. That sort of thing. Similarly, to say that psychiatric diagnoses are trendy, what does that actually mean? How much does somebody have to want a diagnosis to count as them just following a trend? So, for example, okay, if somebody solely wants a diagnosis because they say, for example, want to join a community, even though they recognize that they don't really fit the diagnostic criteria at all, even under a modified diagnostic criteria, if there's problems with the DSM, they're still not close to it. That presumably is following a trend. What happens if somebody, for example, starts thinking of themselves as having a psychiatric diagnosis, which they may or may not have, rather than thinking of an alternative because psychiatric diagnoses are more well known today? Does that count as following a trend or not? So they think of themselves as having a psychiatric diagnosis rather than just being simply unusual. Whereas, say, 20 years ago, they might have thought of themselves as being unusual rather than having a psychiatric diagnosis. Does that simple thing count as a trend or not? So, again, it depends on how we define trends, I think. And finally, it's worth noting that the ability of us to detect how common a trend actually is might vary depending upon how common it actually is. So let's just take two hypothetical figures here. Imagine if it was actually trendy for 50% of people. If that was the case, it would be relatively easy to detect that there's a trend going on. You do one study, it comes up with, say, 70%. You do another study, it comes up with 30%. You do a third study, it comes up with 45%. We might not be able to exactly determine it's 50%, but it's going to be pretty obvious something's going on. Now, in contrast, if it was, say, 1%, then I think it's pretty difficult to establish that. Lots of studies are just going to come up with 0, some are going to come up with 5% or 3%, and we'd be like, well, is anything going on? We're not totally sure. So I think the actual figure in reality, as it were, will make a difference to whether we're going to be able to detect it or not. The higher the figure, the odds of being able to reliably establish that something's going on is going to be a lot easier than if the figure's very low. Second problem is the problem of outdated evidence. So the key issue here is that trends change over time. Trends don't remain fixed, they can often change, often quite quickly. So what it means is if we try and study a trend, the trend may have changed by the time we get around to studying it and publishing the results. So imagine if in 2023, psychiatric diagnoses are trendy to a specific degree. We then go and do some studies, we try and gather evidence about this, we analyse the evidence, we think about it, we turn it into a paper, goes through peer review, gets published. Suddenly, by the time anyone's reading this paper, looking at the evidence, the trend has changed. Maybe the trend has gone from 1% to 10%, or gone from 10% to 1%. And so you have the danger that the level in which something is trendy might have changed by the time you've got evidence about it, or indeed a new trend may have started, or a trend may have entirely stopped by the time we have some evidence about this trend. Third problem is that often trends are unconscious. So somebody follows a trend without actually realizing that they're following a trend. So imagine if we had a study, we just went out there and asked people, do you think psychiatric diagnoses are trendy? Or probably more realistically, it would be the case of, do you think the psychiatric diagnoses are more popular or more popular today than they used to be? That sort of thing. Do you think psychiatric diagnoses are in some sense positive or negative? Those sorts of questions. There could be lots and lots of important empirical data could be established. And just to be clear, if we ask somebody these questions, they could answer for all sorts of fully legitimate reasons. I'm not saying the answers they're going to give is purely because they're following a trend. But hypothetically, if somebody was following a trend, and if that did influence the answer they gave, you may have a situation that they're not realizing they're following the trend. They're not realizing that their thoughts about psychiatric diagnoses are being influenced by the trend because it's being held unconsciously. Similarly, trends are easier to spot after they've finished. So there's a particular period in time where the trend isn't there, and then people start following the trend, and then it ends, and we sort of look back 10 years later and say, oh yeah, I just noticed there was a definite trend going on there. It sort of just appeared out of nowhere maybe, and then it disappeared pretty quickly. Much easier to spot them after they've done, because they occur unconsciously to at least some degree. So if we were to try and establish if these trends are happening, well, lots of people might answer honestly, but not be aware that they're happening. The fourth problem is that someone can follow a trend, know they're following the trend, but not actually admit that they're following the trend. Following trends can, in a sense quite paradoxically, actually not be fashionable. As much as the trend comes into fashion, also, at some point, people who are seen to follow the trend are viewed as being sellouts. They're not genuine. As such, when someone does follow a trend, they might not actually report that they're following the trend, even though they actually know that they are. And so this is another difficulty of detecting the level that a trend is present. Fifth problem is that of subgroups. So trends can actually occur within only subgroups, as in very specific people within the population, rather than being spread roughly equally across the entire population. And so you might have a situation where a trend is trendy in a particular subgroup, but is not trendy outside of that subgroup. This then leads to two potential problems. If you were to, say, sample the entire population, that sample might pick up very few people in the subgroup, and as such, you'd find that the trend isn't occurring, or at least occurring to an extremely small degree. It conceals the way in which it's actually very trendy within a particular subgroup. At the same time, if you were to study a particular subgroup and found it was trendy there, and then didn't realise that subgroup is different to the general population, you might start saying that the trend is actually very common, even though it's actually only very common within a very small set of people and not the wider population. And so these are two different ways in which, depending on what groups you look at, it might not pick up the trend or pick it up too much in a sense. Problem number 6 is counter-trends. So trends can lead to counter-trends. Some people, when they see a trend, will potentially try and do the opposite, the counter-trend, potentially because they might, for example, disagree with the trend in some regard. So, for example, if say somebody thought that people were thinking psychiatric diagnoses were trendy, that may then lead to some other people to be even more against psychiatric diagnoses. And so it starts a counter-trend against people who see psychiatric diagnoses as being trendy. It might start people thinking that psychiatric diagnoses are even worse than how people thought of them beforehand. And so we might do a study and we might pick up on the counter trend rather than the actual trend that would conceal the degree to which a trend is occurring. Or indeed, we might say pick up on the trend and miss out on the counter trend. So even if we established that the trend was occurring, it would give an incorrect account because it's missing out on the other thing that's actively going against the trend. Problem number 7 is that someone might falsely believe something is trendy. So this potentially sounds like a bit of a contradiction in terms, but the basic idea is that though there's not actually a trend occurring, somebody falsely believes the trend is occurring and hence starts following this non-existent trend. That being, they're assuming that lots of other people really like psychiatric diagnoses, and so they themselves start liking psychiatric diagnoses without actually realising that very few people like psychiatric diagnosis. This isn't so much saying that psychiatric diagnoses are trendy, it just might give an explanation of how some specific people might see them as trendy, even though they're actually not. And of course, this would only affect a limited number of people, because if more people actually did this, then it would actually become a trend. But finally, I just want to consider who's in a good position to see whether psychiatric diagnoses are trendy. One potential source is people with psychiatric diagnoses themselves. Are they in a good position to establish whether psychiatric diagnoses are trendy? Well, obviously, as people who actually have psychiatric diagnoses and who are often treated in pretty terrible ways, they at least have some idea of what people think of psychiatric diagnoses. But I suppose the potential concern here is to what degree are they representative of everyone else? To what degree are people with psychiatric diagnoses, or more specifically, people who we agree should definitely have psychiatric diagnoses, to what degree do they actually have more familiarity with that particular subgroup and less familiarity with the majority of other subgroups? I can only talk about myself as an autistic individual. I'm pretty socially isolated. I don't know what's going on with the majority of people. To what degree is that also applicable to other people with psychiatric diagnoses? I don't know. Then you could ask clinicians, so medical professionals who see people with psychiatric diagnoses. And you might say, well, they're in a good position because they're going to see lots of people with psychiatric diagnoses or people wanting psychiatric diagnoses. And so they could be in a good position to establish just what people think about psychiatric diagnoses. Well, the trouble here is we're only going to see people who either the state pays to see them or who can afford to see them. And that might not give a particularly representative view, especially it's not going to give a representative view for obvious reasons of people who self-diagnose. So again, it's not clear to what degree they're in a good position to make this judgment. Finally, just looking at social media and social media activism, well, the trouble is that at least myself, I follow particular people and presumably get followed by particular people on, say, Twitter, that's again not representative for general population. I'm only seeing so much, and how do I know what I'm seeing is a trend or not? So even if I were to see, as I often do, see people talking in a positive way about psychiatric diagnoses, I'm well aware that that's A, not representative for general population, and secondly, they might be talking about it for many other reasons than because it's trendy. If somebody's only got, is it 140 characters on Twitter? If I see a single tweet, I'm not really in a position to make a reliable judgment on are they saying this because of this reason or that reason, including because it's trendy. I literally, I don't think that's possible without very severe levels of empirical information. So I don't want to rule out any of these three groups as being reliable judges, but at the same time, I think all of them are potentially limited. To conclude, I think it'll be quite difficult to reliably establish to what degree trends are occurring in relation to psychiatric diagnosis being seen as trendy or fashionable or desirable. Getting reliable statistical information about to what degree those phenomena are occurring, I think, would be quite difficult. Now, that, to my mind, means that unless someone can supply this sort of strong evidence, we need to be quite cautious. So, I'm not convinced at all by some of the very extreme claims I've been made, but ultimately, is it occurring to a higher degree than I think? That could be the case. I don't know. I don't have reliable information to make this judgment. That's my basic point, and I can't see any easy way for someone to produce this reliable information. I think we need a level of caution. Now, that's probably something that most people are going to disagree with, those people who think they are trendy versus not, because they seem to have very strong disagreements with one another. What I would also say is if people do have strong evidence, as in statistical evidence, it would be good to specify what it is. Show us your evidence. If you're going to make a strong claim, provide strong evidence. If you can't provide strong evidence, then give your opinion. Give an argument as to why you think it is, but ultimately say, actual firm scientific evidence, we don't currently have that. That's what I think should happen. I'm sure lots of people will disagree with me. Thank you for listening.